Hey guys, I have a really cool guest on today, Sean from the YouTube channel Sean Pablo. You want to introduce yourself real quick?
Hey guys, what's going on? I'm Sean Pablo. I live in Seoul, South Korea, and I make YouTube videos about Korean culture, dating culture, and language learning. I speak fluent Korean.
저는 원래 그 영어 선생님으로 왔는데 그때 서울 아닌 좀 서울에서 떨어진 충주라는 도시에서 1년 동안 거기서 영어를 가르쳤어요.
So definitely check my channel out if you're interested in these things. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, so we actually just recorded a video for Sean's channel where we were talking about what language is more difficult, Japanese or Korean. And when we were kind of preparing for the video and talking amongst ourselves, we were kind of realizing that Japanese and Korean have way more in common than they have different. And so for this video on my channel, I figured we could just kind of have an open discussion exploring all the similarities between Japanese and Korean.
I love
And
it.
yeah, so one thing that I think is both unique to Japanese and Korean, but they both share is having a kind of honorific hierarchy of having these different registers where you can say the same thing but with different levels of politeness and stuff like that. So why don't you talk a little bit about how that works in Korean?
Yeah, so we have like a lot of levels. There's like 5 or 6 levels. I'll just give an example. Like, what are you doing? Would be like the very low. You would say this like from like a mother would say this to her child, a teacher to his or her student, or a friend to a friend of the same age. It'd be like, "Whoa, hey, what are you doing?" It's the shortest, easy to say. It's comfortable. Up a level to like "Whoa, hey, yo." If you tag on the yo to something, I think it's similar in Japanese. You can add yo, right? It makes it a little bit more formal. It's like, what would you say to like a new student who's around your age level? So the next level would be like a employee to a customer in like a department store. You can imagine it would be like 뭐 하세요. So it's getting longer. It's getting to be like you're burdening yourself with the burden of being polite. You're bending over, so to speak, verbally with your mouth, with your tongue. 뭐 하세요. Then you would say like in the army or to like someone like really like high, like your commander in the army, and you're like the private, you're the grunt. 뭐 하십니까? Or 뭐 합니까? 뭐 합니까? If you have like ka on the end, it would be like very formal. And then 뭐 하십니까? Would be extremely formal. Now the interesting thing about Korean is like if you say 뭐 하십니까 to like someone in a department store to the customer, it would be too much. It would be too much. So you
Hmm.
kind of have to find the right level of formality. If you're making a speech or you're saying something like 뭐 하세요, it would be okay, but like 뭐 하십니까, it would just be it'd be too hard, you know. So they even say in Korean you have to soften things up if you're speaking too formally. It's really there's a lot to learn within Korean in this aspect.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that definitely sounds very similar to Japanese. And I also should just say I haven't studied Keigo, which is the Japanese politeness system, that extensively. So I
아,
apologize if I say anything that's incorrect. Please point me out in the comment section. I think I have a decent grasp of it, but it sounds like you're saying, yeah, there's five main levels of the hierarchy of politeness in Korean, whereas there's mainly just three in Japanese, as far as my understanding, which is just everyday casual speech, which you would use with someone who is an equal to you. So it's also used inside of the household. So, you know, talking to your family, talking to people who are in the same grade as you, or maybe talking to people who are on a lower rank than you. And then there's a level that's just general being polite. So it's what you would use when you're talking to a stranger who you don't know, or if you are asking someone like an employee at a store to help you with something, you would use that level. And then there's actually honorific where you're speaking up to someone. And when you're speaking up to someone, you actually put yourself down because that makes the other person higher up, relatively speaking. And so, in that truly honorific level of speech, there's two sets of every verb because there's the verb that you use to someone else to put them up, and then there's the verb that you would use towards yourself to put yourself down. But ultimately, you
Ah.
can think of that as the same register as just politeness. And then I also know that there's specific language, like you mentioned, how there's language just for the army. When I heard that, I was thinking how I know that, for example, in Zen temples, there's a whole set of language that they use just for Zen monks who live at a Zen temple and
Oh
meditate.
wow.
But it's not really a level of politeness. It doesn't have to do with how they conjugate verbs. It's just like they have different words for normal everyday things, like a different word for bathroom and a different word for door and a different word for like friend and stuff like that. And I think it's similar with the army. There's a whole set of like army terms for the same everyday things. And they do this so that it's like part of the conditioning process of like conditioning the discipline into you of being part of the system is you have to relearn this new way of talking. And, you know, this way of using language is completely associated in that person's mind with this formal setting and all the rules of the setting and things like that. So there's that. It sounds a little different. But yeah, so overall, it sounds like I would still say that the Korean politeness hierarchy sounds like more difficult because in general, there's even more levels that you have to be working with.
Well, it's not like someone's going to like scold you or you're going to get like penalized in some way if you make a slight mistake between like level 4 and level 5. But like it's noticeable. It's more like a sense of like awkwardness. If you're making a speech and you do way too formal, it's like showing up to a party in like a pristine tuxedo where like everybody else is wearing, you know, a button-up shirt. If you do one level higher, it's not that bad, but it's like, you know what I mean? I guess that's the point.
Yeah, yeah. And so that makes me wonder, so as a foreigner, if you misuse the correct level of politeness, do they cut you more slack because you're a foreigner and they understand that it's your second language?
Yes, they do. Although, I mean, they wouldn't like it to hear like an old woman from like a younger man wouldn't like to be spoken to in the very like lowest casual speech. She'd be like, yeah, it's okay, you know, but she wouldn't. But you wouldn't like get scolded like, "How dare you speak to me like that?" Whereas like,
but
if
a Korean might have gotten scolded like that if it was a native Korean.
Yeah. I actually remember I was in a park. This was years ago. I was in a park and a bunch of people were drinking, and there was this one older drunk Korean guy, and he was kind of like a troublemaker. But he got into a fight with another Korean guy because the other Korean guy spoke too casually to him. And I always thought that was interesting. It was only because of the way he spoke to him.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen similar things like that in Japanese when
Yeah.
someone will say like, "Hey, speak up to me. I'm your senior," and stuff like that. And there's also definitely a similar phenomenon where if you're a foreigner and you're clearly not completely fluent in the language, even if you speak in the wrong register, they're just going to assume, oh, he doesn't understand. They're not going to hold it against you. But I think there is an interesting effect where once you start to get to a higher level of Japanese ability, they're going to start to hold you to higher standards. Because if you seem to be completely fluent in the language and expressing yourself just fine, and you speak in the wrong level of politeness, they might kind of be like, hey, cut that out. That's disrespectful. You seem to know better than that, you know? So it's almost like you're given more responsibility as your level starts to increase, which is an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, same thing here. I have a friend who he grew up in Korea and his Korean's just like native. It's like completely fluent, and he definitely gets held to higher standards. I like that though. I prefer to be held to higher standards. I don't like to live and have a handicap, like, you know.
Yeah, totally. So then I guess just broadening that out. So how do Koreans react to someone who clearly doesn't look Korean speaking their language?
Their head explodes. It's like, oh my God. Like like I can imagine, because Korea has been very isolated for a very long time, longer than Japan. Japan, I think, opened its doors up to foreigners earlier than Korea did. So when you see like a non-Korean person speaking Korean, they're so impressed. They're so happy to see it because it's like a recognition of their own culture, their language. But it's funny because of K-pop and the Korean wave, a lot of foreigners are now learning Korean. So that is slowly disappearing. And the amount of foreigners here that speak Korean well is rising like every day. So definitely the effect is lessening, but still you're going to get people complimenting you just by you saying hello, you know, like, oh, 안녕하세요. Oh, 한국말 잘하시네요. Like, wow, you speak so well. Like, I only just said hello, you know. 아니, 근데 발음이, they're like, oh no, but you speak with such good pronunciation.
Yeah, the exact same thing in Japanese where, even if you just do a basic self-introduction or say, oh, hello, how are you? I'm studying Japanese. And there's this meme like, Nihongo jozu, which basically means, oh, your Japanese is so good. But because it's so notorious for being used in response to people just doing a basic self-introduction or something, now Japanese learners are starting to realize that they shouldn't get so happy about being told that their Japanese is super good because it's not really that impressive. What's really impressive is when you sound so good and so natural that they actually don't respond to the fact that you're speaking Japanese at all. I mean, that's kind of unrealistic if you're in person and they can see that you obviously aren't Japanese. But basically, your goal should be to get a response more like, oh, wow, your Japanese is good. How long have you been living in Japan? Rather than like, oh, wow, good job. That's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. It's so funny. A few years ago, I was still kind of like a beginner/intermediate in Korean. they would say the same thing. Like, oh, it was always 한국말 잘하시네요. You speak Korean so well. They always react the same way. And then I'm like, oh, wow, it's very kind. I feel so good. But the more I witness this happening to other friends who just said hello, exactly. You gotta look for the more specific compliments like, oh, do you have a Korean wife? Or or like, how long have you been here? Or are you in the army? Or like there's this like they're suspicious and I'm like, yes. These are like language learner goals, You
Yeah, totally. So one thing that I've kind of experienced with Japanese people is that when you start to get a higher level, a lot of Japanese people can't really understand why you're so interested in Japanese language and Japanese culture because they see themselves as a kind of minor, irrelevant island country and the West as the center of the modern world. So they're like, why would you be so interested in us? And it's kind of puzzling to them. Do you find that Korean people react the same way?
Absolutely. It's funny that you say that Japanese people often ask people that are not Japanese this question because at least in the eyes of even Korean people, but in Americans too, like Japanese culture is very popular. Like anime, like the idea of ninjas and samurais, just like this whole lore of mythology and Japanese culture. To me, it seems obvious why someone would be interested in Japanese culture, but for Koreans, one of the first questions they ask you is like, you could go to China, you could go to Japan. Why come to Korea? Because to them, it's like we're next to North Korea. It's like it's much smaller. They don't really get it. Like you're from America. That's where so many people want to live. Like, why would you come to Korea? And like, there's many reasons anyone could give. Korea is actually an amazing place to live. I love living in Seoul. I love my life here. But it's definitely very peculiar to a lot of Koreans. Like, why Korea? Like, yeah,
and I mean,
get that question a lot.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense that that's something similar. And I mean, in a way, I think it is kind of peculiar, whether it's Japan or Korea. Like growing up as a Westerner and deciding you're going to go live in an Asian country and you're going to learn their language to a high level. In a way, it is a kind of peculiar thing. But I definitely think that, yeah, sometimes they can't see the appeal of their own country because they're inside of it, right? It's like a fish in water. So it's hard for them to see what would be so appealing about it from the perspective of someone from a totally different culture.
100%. I think the grass is always greener. I can't tell you how many Korean friends I've had who have been dying to get out of the country to live in another place, and then they come back and then they're like, I love Korea. Like, like they realize how many good things there are about living here. Or even in other cases, like I have a lot of American friends who just miss America. I mean, I think that's one of the amazing benefits of living abroad and traveling even. You get to realize the jewels and the amazing aspects of your own country.
Yeah, totally agree.
This is another thing I want to add. This is very different from the West. Me as an American, like in Korea, it's just like a different culture. If you're with a friend and they gain weight, you can say, "Oh wow, you've gained a lot of weight." Or if you have two people who are both speaking Korean, the native Korean will be like, wow, he speaks better than him, or she speaks better than her. Like they're very forward with that. And you're just like, you got to take it because that's just the way it is in Korea. They're very honest. It's not like the West. So you'll definitely get humbled very quickly. If you're the only one who's a foreigner speaking Korean, oh, 한국말 잘하시네요. You speak well. But if there's two Korean speaking foreigners, they will very quickly let you know who speaks better. So
yeah, that is actually really interesting because with regards to the having lost or gained weight, Japanese people are exactly the same, and they will just say straight to your face like, "Oh wow, you got fatter," or also, "Oh wow, you lost weight." It's both ways. It's not only the more negative one. But I've never heard a Japanese person say anything like, "Oh, his Japanese is better than his," talking to foreigners. They seem to almost pretend that there's no differences in ability in that level. So that's pretty interesting. And in general, Japan, for a lot of areas, tends to have a very indirect way of saying things, like instead of saying like, "Oh, that's really rude, cut it out," they'll be like, "Oh, maybe it would be not so bad if you were a little bit more thoughtful about the people around you," and things like that. So, and that is interesting to think about why there's certain aspects where Japanese people will be really direct and then almost everything else where they're mostly very roundabout. But what about Korean people? Are there also areas where they're very roundabout?
Oh, Koreans are, I would say, 75% of the time more roundabout. There's only a few instances where they're very direct. I'd say one would be appearance. Like And it's like you said, it's not even always negative. It's like, oh, you look really skinny. Are you having a hard time these
Mhm.
days? Are you stressed? Are you depressed? They're like literally concerned about you, which feels good, you know. I would say language, they wouldn't do it to two strangers like, oh, he speaks better than him. It would be like more like if one of them is your friend and you're the Korean and this guy's your friend, is like you're poking at your friend like you got to get on his level, you know? It's more like that. It wouldn't be like you walking to random people. I would say in most cases Koreans are very roundabout. There is that the commonality. Like for example, if you were to ask a girl out on a date and she's not into you, she wouldn't be like no. She would just be like, I kind of have a lot of work that day, so maybe next time or maybe next week I'll check my schedule and let you know. Like the most roundabout way to like make it very difficult. Like you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
days I'm not feeling so well, so maybe next month, like when I maybe, you know, uh
Yeah.
you're applying for a job, it's like, oh, we'll call you back if like we like, you know, like actually 75-80% of the time it's very roundabout in Korea.
Yeah, so that sounds very similar to Japan as well. Like, especially
Yeah.
if you ask someone on a date, they'll normally say like, "Oh, sorry, I've been kind of busy," or
Yeah.
and there's also this very notorious phrase in Japanese called "iketara iku," which means "I'll go if I can." So if you get invited to a party, be like, "Hey, I'm having a party, you should come." Be like, "Oh yeah, if I'll see if I can make it, I will go." And already within Japanese society, everyone knows this just means you're not gonna go.
Yeah, all right,
Even
they got
Japanese
that
people kind
coming.
of know that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so funny. It's the same in Korean. Like if it's not a hell yeah, it's probably a no, you know. And some cases like it's not, but probably, you know. It's so funny.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually interesting because I've seen interactions between Japanese people where they have a hard time communicating that no, 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 they really want to go, but they actually can't because they actually have a doctor's appointment, but they actually really do want to go. And they have to say it like 5 times because they're worried that the other person's going to think they're just politely refusing, even if they actually do just having a doctor's appointment that day. And so, in a way, that is a kind of negative consequence of having this overly polite culture in Japan.
Yeah. I think in Korean too, it's really interesting. There's this word that's very difficult to translate into English called nunchi. Nunchi means like your ability to read the sense, that read the atmosphere,
Mm.
read the room. So this ability called nunchi is so important and powerful here that it really goes hand in hand with this like indirect way of speaking. So it's like, oh, like there's a phrase in Korean like nunchi 없네, like you have no nunchi. Like if someone can't get a hint, you can say 눈치 왜 이렇게 없어? Like 눈치 너무. So this idea of nunchi, we don't really have it in the West.
Yeah, that's so interesting because they have what it sounds like a practically identical concept in Japanese called kuuki o yomu, which literally means to read the atmosphere. And it's the same thing. It's just sensing what someone's actually feeling or actually intending by reading between the lines. And they'll say like, "Oh yeah, you aren't able to read the atmosphere." And there's like this funny phrase where since it's kuki o yomenai, it's ky, and so they'll actually say like ky and mean like, "Oh, you're someone who can't read the atmosphere," and and that's yeah, like the most awful
Awesome.
label you can be given in Japanese
Yeah.
society because it is such an important aspect of social interaction.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't want to take too much of a dark twist, but I was a teacher. I was an English teacher in Seoul and in other parts of Korea for over 3 years. And actually, the bullying of the younger kids can be kind of severe because there's some kids who just develop later and they don't have that nunchi. So they're often like singled out because they stick out, you know, and they can't follow the way things are going. So I find that to be really interesting too. That kind of disappears when you're older because people are more polite and there's kind of a social standard. But I also noticed that too. I don't know if that's the same in Japan.
Yeah, well, I definitely know that there are bad bullying issues in Japan, but I'm hesitant to say whether this is something unique to Japan and Korea because I know that bullying can be pretty bad in younger kids all around the world. But it's interesting that you mentioned that it kind of goes away when people get older because I think that through high school, I think there can be some pretty overt bullying in Japanese society. But once
Yeah.
it comes to being someone who's just working at a company, there still are forms of bullying, but they become more subtle and they
Oh yeah.
become more like it's not like calling someone a name to their face and stuff like that. It's just more like maybe you knock their papers down, you like kind of bump into them when you walk past them, or you just give them all the crappy jobs if you're their boss, or there's just other ways, or you just ignore them. Like I think that can be another really big way of bullying, is just ignoring people and sending out this signal that, hey, we've decided to ignore that person, and if you don't ignore them, then you're going to get ignored as well, because there's like this mutual agreement thing that happens.
Yeah, definitely a lot of like passive aggressive.
Yeah, that's the word for it.
Behavior.
That's the word.
Yeah. No, I got you.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about how in Japan, it sounds like, as in Korea as well, that at the younger ages, there's more overt bullying, and then that kind of transforms into this passive aggressiveness once you kind of get out into society, because there's this image that Japan, it sounds like Korea as well, is this very polite culture, right? They have all these levels of politeness in the language, and they're so roundabout in their way of talking about lots of things. But I think it's that human nature, we're going to have disagreements. There's going to be people who are naturally rude. Just the way that is kind of expressed in Japan is different because they have these different societal standards. So it just comes out as more passive aggressiveness and so on. Not that we don't have passive aggressiveness in the West, but...
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. In the end, it comes down to an individual basis. Like, if this guy's a jerk, he's going to be a jerk whether he's American or Korean, but he's just going to express it differently depending on the society that he's living in. So, totally.
Yeah, totally.
Definitely a shock for a lot of Westerners coming here, adjusting to this idea of Nunchi, or I can't remember the word you called it in Japanese. But
kuuki.
Kuuki. It says Nunchi, kuuki. Oh,
I wonder if they come from the same like Chinese characters.
So I just looked it up, and it turns out that the Korean word nunchi and the Japanese word kuuki are completely unrelated in origin. The Japanese word kuuki literally means atmosphere, as in atmospheric pressure, whereas the Korean word nunchi literally means eye force or eye power.
Yeah, so on that note, so when we were kind of talking earlier, we kept coming up with these words that they seemed like they're pretty much the same word. They were pronounced very similarly in Korean and Japanese, and we can kind of infer that they derive from the same Chinese word originally, because both Korean and Japanese borrowed so much from the Chinese language. And for a while, they were both using Chinese to write these words, but then Japan kept on using the characters, while Korea switched to their own alphabet, their own writing system. But these words still remain. And I know that Korean people at least learn these characters at one point in school. But in your experience, how many of these characters do Korean people actually know?
Like the actual Chinese characters?
Yeah. Like they do learn them in school, right?
Yes, they do. They do learn them in school, but it is becoming more and more and more absent. They're learning very, very basic Chinese characters. These days, you can find many kids and young people that maybe have learned them but completely forgotten them. Definitely there's people who speak Chinese or like know the characters, but definitely the older people, the older generation in Korea is way more familiar with these characters. But I just want to, I think this might be beneficial to the viewers. With both Korean and Japanese, there's a difference between the native Korean words and then the Sino-Korean, which would be the loan words from Chinese that are adapted into the Korean language. So for an example, very basic things that you could think a farmer could do without the use of complicated language would be like hand, eat, go, head, like brother, sister. These things are all basic Korean. Are they the same? Are they all native Japanese, these same similar kind of words?
Yeah. Well, actually, a lot of times there's multiple words for those things. And the one that derives from Chinese is generally the more polite one and the more formal sounding one. And the one that's originally Japanese is the more casual, everyday one.
It's exactly the same in Korean. So the more casual, formal ones are like the more, you would say it with your buddy, you would say it with your family, but the more polite ones would be like in the news or like, there's so many examples of this, but just to let everybody know, that's what we're talking about. So it would be the same in English. You could think like, okay, there'd be help. Help would be the native English, and then aid, like first aid. Aid is the Latin-based word to kind of communicate this similar idea. Things like democracy or like these higher end words are definitely loan words from French, but it's the same thing in Chinese and Japanese and Korean. So,
yeah, I guess it just stems from China originally being the kind of head of civilization back in the day, and so both Korea and Japan were looking to China, seeing that as where they wanted to go, where they kind of had to catch up to. So those words ended up sounding more prestigious within the language, I guess, when they imported them in.
That's exactly right. And it's funny that you say that Korea and Japan both used the Chinese characters, because that's absolutely correct. 1,000 years ago, only the very educated people in Korea were able to read and write. And we had a very famous king here in Korea called King Sejong. And Sejong created the Hangul, the writing system, so that even the poor people, the uneducated people, could learn to read and write in a day or in a week. So that was his purpose.
Yeah, no, that's interesting how you mentioned that it was originally for poor people to learn how to write,
Yes.
even though everyone uses it today. Because I believe, I might be wrong on this, but I believe that hiragana, one of the phonetic alphabets used in Japanese today, was originally created by women so that women could write more easily.
So I just looked it up, and it turns out that actually hiragana was most likely invented by men, but initially it was only used in very informal situations. And because women in the imperial palace were actually forbidden from learning kanji during around the middle of the Heian period, women were the ones who started to use hiragana more extensively and also start using it in more formal situations. And so by the end of the Heian period, hiragana had also begun to be referred to as onnade, or the female hand.
That is interesting. Yeah, but what you said is absolutely correct. Now everybody uses Hangul because it's so efficient.
Yeah, well, one thing that I have thought about before is if Japan were to adopt a similar type of alphabet that was entirely phonetically based, it seems like there'd be a lot of words that, like, especially kind of more formal words that are tend to be used in formal writing and things like that. There'd become a lot of words that you couldn't distinguish anymore because they're pronounced exactly the same. But because there's the kanji, the Chinese characters, you can tell what the different meanings are. And I imagine it would be a similar thing in Korean since they borrowed so much from Chinese. Or there are a bunch of words that sound exactly the same but mean different stuff.
You're smart. That's exactly right. Yes, that's exactly right. So this is I wouldn't call it a problem because you can always tell through context when speaking or like reading a paragraph. But sometimes in newspapers, they still use the Chinese characters because you're reading the headline and you don't have time to figure out the context. So they put like the two characters and they'll put the Chinese next to it so that it's that, you know.
When you said that the younger generation is getting weaker and weaker with the characters, what are they going to do when they have to read a newspaper headline and use the characters to tell which meaning a word is?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. That's a really good question. I'm not going to give you a bullshit answer because I don't really know. That's a really good question. You know what? It's funny. I would actually, the craziest thing, I've seen this a few times now. They're starting to do that same thing with English. Isn't that crazy? So instead of using the Chinese character to clarify ambiguous, I've seen a few times now, they just put in an English word.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
That reminds me, that was another thing I wanted to ask is Japan recently is importing a ton of English words into the language.
Yeah.
And so things that traditionally would have been expressed with either a Chinese originated word or just a Japanese word are now just an English word. Like instead of saying doishimasu, they'll say agree desu ne, like, oh yeah, I agree, and things like this. So is this something that they do in Korean as well?
So much. So for example, the word try. I don't know why, but let's try this. Say try. And there's many ways to say try. Like shido hada would be to attempt or try something, or you would add the word to see. I think it's the same in Japanese. Like 이거 먹어 봐요. Let's try to eat this. Let's see what it's like. Or let's
they'll do that.
accent to word. What is it? Shiru?
Shitemiru. They'll say
shitemiru. Yeah, we'd say 해보다, 해보자, 해봐요. Let's try to do something. But still, there's 이거 try 하고 싶다. I want to try. Like, why? But I think it's like 10% of vocabulary in Southern Korean dialect is English. So like internet, orange, banana, even more complicated words like incentive. They take these words like vision, to have a vision of the future or a vision of your business. Bijan.
Yeah.
So
they have that bijon. They have that in Japanese as well. Like most of the ones you said that they use English words for, they're using English words. They're using English for those words in Japanese as well.
Katakana.
Yep. And it's interesting because we were talking a little bit ago about how before Chinese used to be the more prestigious language that they'd want to borrow and put into Japanese to sound cool. And now English is that. And so like a business person who wants to sound smart will use an English word that normally wouldn't be used because it makes them sound more educated and just
exact. Yeah, same exact here in Korea. And they're even doing it on like the cool hip side too. So one word that I've been seeing a lot in these Korean variety shows and reality shows is that it's so weird that they're starting to use like chilling. I'm chilling at home. Chilling, chilling.
Oh,
집에서
they use
chilling.
chiru. Yeah, in
chiru.
Japanese, they have chiruru. They've turned it into a verb. There's like a thing you can add on to a noun to make it a verb, and they'll
Yeah,
just say like, chiruteru, like, yeah, I'm chilling. So
yeah. Same in Korean. You add that to do 하다. So chilling 하고 있어. chilling해. Yeah. It's
that's so
so cool.
funny. One of my favorite ones is disuru, to diss someone, and they use
Yo,
that to mean like to talk
diss,
smack.
diss. That's in Korean too. Diss.
Oh, that's so funny.
자꾸 나를 diss. Yeah. So funny.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so no, you have to go in a second, but I guess just to conclude, it's so interesting how clearly both on a language level and cultural level, Japan and Korea have so much in common, so much more in common than they have different, yet they seem to really not like each other that much.
Yeah, it's very ironic. I will say it is ironic that they're so similar, yet they have so much. They bump heads a lot, but I think a lot of that has to do with history.
Yeah,
And to that point, I'll say that a lot of modern day Japanese people that are young, that are our age, don't really care that much. But like, that was the case at least when I went to Japan about the
yeah,
whole conflict. But a lot of Koreans are very, I would say, bitter. There's a very strong sense of we are one, we are Korean, we all must band together. And if that has to do with history, that is also the case. So a lot of younger Koreans, I think more than Japanese people, are kind of bitter. I tease my girlfriend all the time, like, you know, what happens if you found out tomorrow you're half Japanese? Like, she'd be like, no, no, no. I'm like, what? Like, just anyway. I know I'm
yeah.
not.
It is pretty shocking from like the perspective of someone who grew up in the U.S., you know, and is so sensitized to racism and how unacceptable it is. But hopefully that will get better with time. I'm sure it will as the world continues to globalize. So
Totally. I understand it, but it's just a shame because I love both cultures. So that's the place I'm coming from, is I love both cultures. And like you said, I hope it gets better.
totally. Cool. Well, yeah, thanks so much for coming on. It was really awesome to be able to explore the two languages like this. And yeah, everyone make sure you go and check out Sean's channel.
Right on. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Had a blast, and maybe we'll do it again.
Totally, totally.
All right. Bye.